Nós, estudantes de Relações Internacionais da PUC São Paulo e integrantes do Grupo de Estudos sobre Conflitos Internacionais, em parceria com o Democracy Now!, apresentaremos as notícias da semana.
A partir de agora, vincularemos com legendas em português os principais destaques internacionais.
From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
If you smuggle illegal aliens across our border, then we will prosecute you. If you are smuggling a child, then we will prosecute you. And that child may be separated from you as required by law.
A month after Attorney General Jeff Sessions introduced a new zero-tolerance immigration policy, outrage is growing over the Trump administration separating immigrant families who cross the U.S.-Mexico border. At least 600 immigrant children were removed from their parents over the past month. We go to South Texas, to the epicenter of this zero-tolerance crackdown.
To think that our government is putting kids through this kind of traumatic, and it is traumatic, experience, to send a message to people who are fleeing their countries not out of their own choice, but for their own survival, it amounts to torture.
Plus, we look at the Trump administration's reported plans to build tent cities on military bases near the U.S.-Mexico border to accommodate the increasing numbers of migrant children being held. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn today to the headlines. The White House says it will back either of a pair of immigration bills heading towards a possible vote in the Congress next week after House Speaker Paul Ryan said he'll allow a debate on immigration. White House senior advisor Stephen Miller said President Trump supports the bills, which would provide a path to citizenship for young undocumented immigrants while spending an additional $25 billion for a border wall with Mexico, ending the visa lottery system and sharply curtailing the number of visas given to legal immigrants. An even harsher bill would also crack down on sanctuary cities while requiring employers to use the federal E-Verify program. Both measures have been condemned by immigrant rights groups. Christine Newman-Ortiz, executive director of Voices of the Border, said, quote, Speaker Ryan's decision is another disgraceful sign that the Republican Party is the party of anti-immigrant hate, waging a war on families. Speaker Ryan cannot call himself a family man when he's willing to destroy other families in service to white nationalists, unquote. Meanwhile, 10 members of Congress protested Wednesday by blocking the entrance to the headquarters of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the agency tasked with carrying out the forced removal of children from their parents. After headlines, we'll go to South Texas, to the epicenter of this zero-tolerance crackdown. Canada's foreign minister appealed directly to U.S. lawmakers Wednesday to end a burgeoning trade war after President Trump ordered steep tariffs on imports of metals from Canada and other U.S. trading partners. Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland spoke to reporters after meeting with members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, including Arizona Republican Senator Jeff Flake.
Can you imagine being in Canada, our closest ally on the planet, and to be told that they represent a national security threat, that the export of steel and aluminum is threatening our national security? That's insulting. It really is.
Canada has, therefore, truly, more in sorrow than in anger, announced a perfectly reciprocal, measured, dollar-for-dollar retaliation response. We have published our retaliatory list. Our tariffs will come into effect on July 1st.
A federal judge ruled Wednesday a lawsuit challenging the U.S. government's secretive kill list can proceed. The suit was brought by U.S. freelance journalist Bilal Abdul Karim, who says he narrowly escaped with his life on several occasions when the U.S. targeted him for airstrikes in Syria. Karim says he was targeted for death because he frequently interviewed militants the U.S. has linked to al-Qaeda. In a decision handed down Wednesday, U.S. District Judge Rosemary Collyer ruled the government cannot deny Karim his constitutional right to due process. A new study finds global warming is accelerating the melting of Antarctica's ice sheet, adding about 200 billion tons of water to the planet's oceans each year and threatening to inundate coastal communities around the globe. The findings in the journal Nature reveal the rate of Antarctica's ice melt has tripled over the past decade as the continent surpassed Greenland as the largest contributor to sea level rise. This comes as two Harvard social scientists argued the Trump administration's rollback of environmental regulations could cause the deaths of an additional 80,000 people or more per decade. Writing in the journal The American Medical Association, JAMA, the scientists say the EPA's rollback of clean air rules alone will cause an additional 1 million Americans to contract respiratory illness. In Yemen, U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition warplanes are bombing the port city of Hodeidah for the second straight day, as aid groups warned of a worsening humanitarian catastrophe. The UN says nearly 8.5 million Yemenis are on the verge of famine, with deaths set to rise as shipments of food and medicine through the port come to a halt. This is Khalid Al-Radi, a resident of Sana'a and father of 10, speaking Wednesday.
Because of the current circumstances, people are suffering. We cannot buy things for our kids and can't financially sustain ourselves on normal days. So imagine what it's like during Ramadan and Eid. I have a household of 11 people. Our situation is dire, and only God knows when we'll get paid our salaries.
The United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly Wednesday to condemn Israel over its massacre of Palestinians protesting nonviolently against Israel's occupation. The vote was 120-8, with only Israel, the U.S., Australia, and 5 U.S.-dependent Pacific Island nations voting against the resolution. The Israeli military has killed at least 124 Palestinians and wounded 14,000 more since the Palestinians' nonviolent Great March of Return protests began in Gaza on March 30th. This is Riyad Mansour, Palestinian ambassador to the United Nations, speaking at Wednesday's General Assembly.
We cannot remain silent in the face of the most violent crimes and human rights violations being systematically perpetrated against our people. Nobody would remain silent. And not only that, we will continue to do everything possible in order to protect our people. This is a right to all people, and the Palestinian people should not be the exception.
In the West Bank city of Ramallah, Palestinian forces using batons and tear gas Wednesday to clear hundreds of protesters, calling on Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to end financial sanctions on the Gaza Strip. The sanctions are aimed at Abbas's rival political party, Hamas. Protesters say the policy has exacerbated the already disastrous effects of Israel's siege. In Mexico, a congressional candidate who's promised to crack down on organized crime was shot in the head and killed just minutes after leaving a debate last Friday. Fernando Perón was the 112th politician murdered in Mexico since last September and the first federal candidate to be assassinated. In La Paz, Bolivia, police fired tear gas and water cannons Wednesday at university students and professors who are calling for more funding for public education. Wednesday's protest was the latest in a series of demonstrations that followed the death of a student killed by police last month during a similar protest. In Argentina, lawmakers are set to vote today on a bill that would decriminalize abortion during the first 14 weeks of pregnancy. As members of Argentina's lower house debated the measure in Buenos Aires Wednesday, protesters squared off in competing rallies outside the palace of the Argentine National Congress. This is abortion rights campaigner Fernanda Gonzalez.
70% of society today is in favor of the legalization of abortion, and there's also a social mobilization supporting it. That doesn't necessarily correlate with our representatives in the House of Deputies, but, well, we believe that it's precisely in moments like this that the deputies must look to the public and not look inwardly nor religiously.
If the bill passes Argentina's lower house today, it'll move to the more conservative Senate, where it faces an uncertain fate. Argentina currently allows abortion only with the permission of a judge in cases of rape or a risk to a pregnant woman's life. In South Korea, President Moon Jae-in's ruling party swept local elections across the country Wednesday as voters showed their approval for Moon's rapprochement with North Korea. The elections came as President Trump declared North Korea no longer poses a nuclear threat to the United States, following his unprecedented summit with leader Kim Jong-un earlier this week. Trump was also questioned over North Korea's abysmal human rights record in an interview with Fox News' Bret Baier that aired on Wednesday.
He's a very smart guy. He's a great negotiator. But I think we understand each other.
But he's still done some really bad things.
Yeah, but so have a lot of other people done some really bad things. I mean, I could go through a lot of nations where a lot of bad things were done.
Trump's comments came as leading Democrats blasted the president's decision to suspend U.S. war games in the Korean Peninsula while the North takes steps towards denuclearization. This is Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer speaking from the Senate floor on Wednesday.
President Trump agreed to freeze joint military exercises with South Korea, and he called them provocations, right out of the North Korean propaganda playbook. Without the knowledge of South Korea or our own military, I guarantee you our military men and women were squirming when President Trump called our joint military exercises provocations.
To see our interview with California Congressmember Ro Khanna, very critical of the Democratic leadership, you can go to democracynow.org. Massachusetts has filed a lawsuit against 16 top executives of Purdue Pharma, the maker of the popular drug OxyContin, claiming they misled doctors, patients, and the public about the dangers posed by the opioid-based painkiller. This is Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey.
Their strategy was simple. The more drugs they sold, the more money they made, and the more people died. We found that Purdue engaged in a multi-billion-dollar enterprise to mislead us about their drugs. Purdue pushed prescribers to give higher doses to keep patients on drugs for longer periods of time, without regard to the very real increased risk of addiction, overdose, and death.
Drug overdoses are now the leading cause of death for Americans under the age of 50, with opioids as the #1 driver. To see our interview with the Pulitzer Prize-winning former New York Times journalist Barry Meyer on his book Painkiller, about OxyContin, about Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, you can go to democracynow.org. In Los Angeles, prosecutors are reviewing a sexual assault allegation against actor Sylvester Stallone. Stallone's attorney said in December a woman had filed a police report against the actor alleging he raped her in the 90s. Stallone denies the claims. In Texas, a black woman sentenced to 5 years in prison for voter fraud has lost her bid for a new trial. Crystal Mason was convicted of illegal voting in March after she cast a provisional ballot in the 2016 presidential election despite having a past felony conviction for tax evasion that prevented her from voting. Mason says she did not know she wasn't allowed to vote in Texas due to her criminal record. According to a 2016 report by the Sentencing Project, policies restricting the voting rights of convicted felons disenfranchise more than 6 million people. Crystal Mason's supporters are demanding charges be dropped, arguing her conviction was racially biased. This follows a voter fraud conviction in Iowa, where Terry Lynn Rote, a white woman, was convicted of the same crime after she tried to vote for President Trump twice. Rote was sentenced to 2 years probation and fined $750. And in media news, the associate editor of the Independent newspaper was arrested Wednesday in Jersey City after interrupting a city council meeting to protest Mayor Steve Fulop's decision to remove newspaper boxes from the city's streets. 3 other staff members of the monthly progressive newspaper were also removed by police from the city council chambers for protesting. At least 240 news boxes were removed from their Jersey City locations with no advance notice earlier this month, according to The Independent, including 90 boxes used by the Spanish-language weekly El Especialito. This is associate editor Peter Rue being led away from the city council meeting in handcuffs. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We're very proud of what took place today. I think our whole relationship with North Korea and the Korean Peninsula is it's going to be a very much different situation than it has in the past. And we're going to take care of a very big and very dangerous problem for the world. And I want to thank Chairman Kim.
After an historic summit in Singapore, President Trump and North Korean President Kim Jong-un have pledged to work toward complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. It marked the first time the leaders of the two countries have ever met. After the summit, President Trump announced the end of U.S. war games with South Korea, admitting the exercises have been very provocative and inappropriate. We'll air highlights from Trump and Kim's remarks.
우리는 오늘 역사적인 이 만남에서
We had a historic meeting and decided to leave the past behind, and we are about to sign a historic document.
세상은 아마
The world will see a major change.
We'll go to Singapore, to Washington and Chicago for the latest. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un have wrapped up an historic summit in Singapore, where they pledged to work toward complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The summit marked the first-ever meeting between a sitting U.S. president and a North Korean leader. Following the historic meeting, President Trump announced the end of U.S.-South Korean war games.
We'll be stopping the war games, which will save us a tremendous amount of money, unless and until we see that the future negotiation is not going along like it should. But we'll be saving a tremendous amount of money. Plus, I think it's very provocative.
That was President Trump speaking at a news conference early this morning. It was his first full news conference in more than a year. Trump also expressed hope for an end to the Korean conflict.
An extremely bloody conflict ravaged the Korean Peninsula. Countless people died in the conflict, including tens of thousands of brave Americans. Yet while the armistice was agreed to, the war never ended, to this day, never ended. But now we can all have hope that it will soon end, and it will soon end. The past does not have to define the future.
After headlines, we'll go to Singapore for more on this historic meeting between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. In major immigration news, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced Monday domestic violence will no longer be grounds for asylum, a far-reaching shift that could affect thousands of women fleeing gender-based violence, particularly from Central America. Sessions overturned a precedent set in a 2014 Immigration Appeals Court ruling that had granted asylum to a Guatemalan woman named Aminta Cifuentes, who'd fled to the United States after being brutally abused by her husband for years, beaten, kicked, burned with acid, punched so hard in the stomach when she was 8 months pregnant her child was born prematurely and with bruises. He told her it was pointless to go to the police because, quote, even the police and judges beat their wives. She did go to the authorities, who recommended she leave him, but when she did, he tracked her down, raped her, threatened to kill her. She then fled to the United States, where she finally won asylum. But on Monday, Attorney General Jeff Sessions overturned the precedent set in her case, ruling, quote, claims by aliens pertaining to domestic violence or gang violence perpetrated by non-governmental actors will not qualify for asylum, he said. Immigration lawyers have condemned the ruling, which could have sweeping effects not only for women fleeing domestic violence, but all people fleeing gang-based violence. Karen Musalo of the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies at the University of California Hastings College of Law said, quote, what this decision does is yank us all back to the dark ages of human rights and women's human rights, unquote. This comes as the Washington Post is reporting that the Honduran asylum seeker who died by suicide after Border Patrol agents forcibly separated him from his 3-year-old child had come to the United States with his family fleeing violence. The Honduran consulate says Marco Antonio Munoz and his family fled Honduras after Munoz's brother-in-law was murdered. After they arrived in the U.S., they voluntarily surrendered to Border Patrol agents and said they wanted to apply for asylum. But when agents told Munoz he would be separated from his 3-year-old son, he appears to have had a panic attack. The agents then ripped the boy out of his arms, transported Munoz to a Texas jail where he was found dead by suicide the following morning. A newly published open letter signed by over 1,000 mental health professionals and organizations, has condemned the Trump administration's practice of separating children and parents at the border, writing, quote, "We cannot afford to forget that there's a history of separating children from their parents during slave auctions, during the forced assimilation of American Indians, and during the Holocaust. To somehow convince ourselves that this systematic traumatization of children has no bearing on the lives of these children and no impact on the legacy of our country is to be living in an alternate universe. And to not care about the impact these policies have on these children is to succumb to the worst potential of humanity," the letter said. In a major voting rights case, the Supreme Court has ruled 5-4 to uphold Ohio's decision to aggressively purge voters from the rolls. The ruling allows Ohio to purge voters from the rolls if they haven't voted in recent elections and don't respond to a notice from election officials. A 2016 Reuters survey found nearly 150,000 people were removed from the voting rolls in recent years in Ohio's 3 largest counties alone. A handful of other states have similar voting laws. The ruling to uphold Ohio's decision to remove voters from the rolls is part of a nationwide battle over voter suppression efforts pushed by the Republican Party. On Monday, scores of people were arrested in front of the Supreme Court as part of a national day of action for the new Poor People's Campaign protesting poverty and racism. This is Reverend Dr. William Barber speaking at the rally just before he, too, was arrested.
How many of you understand how the Supreme Court justices get on the court? They get what? Nominated by who? And then they get what? By the Senate. How do senators get into office? So you understand why voting suppression is a labor issue? Voter suppression is not just a black issue, it's a labor issue, it's a poor people's issue. Because if you suppress the vote, you undermine the ability to elect people. And if you undermine the ability to elect people, you get people elected that will give you a regressive Supreme Court. So you can't separate voting rights from labor rights. It's not that the black folk over here fighting for voting rights and the white folk over here fighting for labor rights. We all better be fighting for all of our rights, every one of them.
9 religious leaders led by Reverend Liz Theo Harris were arrested at the Supreme Court and have been held overnight in jail by Capitol Police. They were among dozens of people arrested in nationwide protests staging a moral revival 50 years after Martin Luther King Jr.'s original Poor People's Campaign. In downtown Boston, protesters blocked traffic to demand a higher minimum wage. In Olympia, Washington, activists erected tents to protest homelessness and unaffordable housing. In Sacramento, California, hundreds rallied outside the California Association of Realtors office to protest evictions. Monday's actions were part of the Poor People's Campaign's 5th week of nationwide protests, leading to a major march in Washington on June 23rd. The Washington Post is reporting President Trump's daughter, Ivanka, and her husband, Jared Kushner, both advisors to President Trump, raked in at least $82 million in outside income last year, even as both served as senior White House advisors. Ivanka Trump received nearly $4 million from her stake in the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C., $2 million from the Trump Organization, $5 million from the trust that oversees her clothing brand. Her husband, Jared Kushner, raked in a total of $70 million from dozens of companies tied to his family's real estate company, Kushner Companies. Ethics experts say the extraordinary income flow, while the two are serving as senior White House advisors, raises concerns about conflicts of interest. In Yemen, the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition bombed a new Doctors Without Borders cholera clinic in Yemen's northwest Abs region. Doctors Without Borders said that before the strike, the group had provided the coordinates of the clinic to the Saudi-led coalition and that the roof of the building clearly identified it as a medical site. The ongoing U.S.-backed Saudi-led war in Yemen has sparked the world's worst cholera epidemic, with more than 1 million people afflicted. This comes as the United Nations is warning an impending Saudi-led offensive on the Yemeni port city of Hodeidah could have catastrophic humanitarian consequences. This is Mark Lowcock, the UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs.
7 million people are completely reliant every month on food, and more than 7 million on other assistance from humanitarian organizations. So Hodeidah is absolutely central to the preserving of life. And if for any period Hodeidah were not to operate effectively, the consequences in humanitarian terms would be catastrophic.
The Wall Street Journal reports the Trump administration is weighing expanding its role in the war in Yemen by providing direct assistance to the impending Saudi-led offensive against that port city of Hodeidah. In Syria, the United Nations says nearly 1 million people were displaced inside Syria during the first 4 months of this year, the highest levels of internal displacement since the Syrian conflict began 7 years ago. In total, more than 6 million Syrians are displaced inside the country, with another 5.5 million Syrian refugees displaced outside Syria's borders. In Vietnam, police detained over 100 people protesting against proposed special economic zones amidst widespread demonstrations in recent days. The protests have forced lawmakers to postpone a vote on whether to approve a new law that would give foreign investors 99-year leases on land inside the special economic zones. The Spanish government has agreed to allow a boat carrying more than 600 refugees to dock in Valencia after Italy's new anti-immigrant government turned the boat away, leaving the hundreds of refugees stranded in the Mediterranean. The boat is carrying over 120 unaccompanied children and 7 pregnant women. In Italy, the mayor of Naples, Luigi De Magistris, condemned the Italian government's decision to reject the refugee boat.
The port of Naples is open. Whoever prevents a ship from docking in a port to save lives, whoever puts human lives at risk, not only behaves in an undignified, shameful, and ethically reprehensible way, but commits a crime against humanity and will be called to answer before international tribunals.
And the Department of Education has launched a federal investigation into the University of Southern California's handling of sexual abuse claims against the school's former gynecologist, Dr. George Tyndall. Authorities say school administrators receive reports of sexual abuse during pelvic exams dating back to the early 1990s, but failed to investigate these reports until 2016. Authorities say Dr. Tyndall may have seen 10,000 patients. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.